on too, right? Yes.
I think so, yeah. Juliet will do that when we start. Okay, I think YouTube, sorry, the numbers are stabilizing. So it leaves me to say welcome to the final Angevin talk of the series. Thank you to everyone for joining. I'm sure this will be a fantastic conversation. So I'll now hand over to Anna. Remember that we will have a Q&A at the end, so keep your questions ready.
Thank you very much, Alice. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest this evening, Jared Cohen, a phenomenon in the tech world and a force of nature. Jared is the CEO of Jigsaw, formerly known as Google Ideas, and is an adjunct fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. For 4 years at a very young age, he served as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and was one of the few staffers that remained on to advise Hillary Clinton after having been brought on by Condoleezza Rice as her advisor. In this capacity, Jared focused on counterterrorism and counter-radicalization, internet freedom, and fostering opposition in repressive countries, and has also been named by Time as one of its 100 most influential people. For his academic journey, Jared did his undergraduate degree at Stanford and then went on to earn his master's degree in international relations at Oxford. While he was in Oxford, he really wasn't at Oxford because he was in Iran for a number of months. He was in Iraq, he was in Afghanistan and in Syria. And once the story goes, he's made his way to the Democratic Republic of Congo by hiding under a pile of bananas in a truck. This, Jared, is not your usual Rhodes Scholar experience. Jared wrote his first book, 100 Days of Silence, America and the Rwandan Genocide, followed by his next book called Children of Jihad, a young American's travels amongst the youth of the Middle East. On his travels, as part of his research, he interviewed members of Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the Taliban, Somali pirates, and pretty much every violent extremist he could meet with. After the State Department, Jared went on to become the first director of Google Ideas that later was spun out into Jigsaw, which Jared founded and now runs as CEO. Jigsaw is tasked with investing in and building technology to address humanity's most intractable problems, from countering violent extremism, surveillance, and the list goes on. In 2011, Jared co-authored a book with Eric Schmidt, Google's then executive chair, The New Digital Age, Reshaping the Future of People, Nations, and Business, which became a New York Times bestseller. And most recently, Jared wrote an incredible book called Accidental Presidents, 8 Men Who Changed America, that has also become a New York Times bestseller. Jared, a very, very warm welcome.
Thanks, Anna. It's great to be here.
You work in tech and in foreign policy. Then you write your 4th book, Accidental Presidents. 5.5 years writing this book and a lifetime of fascination. How did this all get started?
Well, first of all, I have this fantasy of living in the mountains in a cabin writing about obscure presidential history. So in some respects, that dream is satisfied. But when I think some of it has to do with how I think about my career in general. Some people describe themselves as a serial entrepreneur. I'm a serial curiosity chaser. And when people ask me, what do you do? I say I manage a portfolio of my curiosities. And maybe I thought I was really long on tech and foreign policy and too short on dead presidents. But it really was a childhood dream of mine. And one of the things that has been particularly rewarding about writing this book is it was an opportunity for me to revisit something that I grew up really excited about and really passionate about. And I encourage every young person to do that, right? We all sort of start somewhere and end up in a different place, and the curiosities that we experience early in life, they may go dormant, but they don't evaporate. They're still in some part of your brain that a biologist would be better able to explain than me. And one of the greatest professional joys that I have in my life is being able to excavate one of those ancient curiosities in my life and really do something meaningful with it. And the nice part about presidential history is it's honestly, it's something that I can work on until the very end of my life. And I viewed it very much like starting a company, right? I mean, you do the research and you write the book, and that's kind of like, the labor of love, and you're building the product and shaping the product. And, other people have something similar, but the unique insight is tying different stories together. And then the publication of it is the IPO, how the book does, or book tour is kind of the roadshow. And then how the book does is, reflective of how the stock performs. So I wrote a book instead of started a different company, but that's very much how I think about it.
Well, your parents, when you were 8 years old, bought you a book called The Buck Stops Here, and you zeroed in on death and assassination.
Well, the story of presidential history, it's actually a pretty grim story. So when my parents bought me that book, George H.W. Bush had just been elected president. And so there were 41 presidents. And so if you look at those 41 presidents, 8 of them died in office. There were several assassination attempts. And so you're an 8-year-old reading this book, and Lincoln is sort of keeled over with blood on his face. McKinley's keeled over with blood on his face. And my parents had to have 8 different conversations with me about death. I mean, I still remember the JFK page. It was 35 is young John F., another president shot to death, right? And so my parents literally, I feel so bad for them. They just wanted to turn me into a precocious kid, and instead they sort of, I was left with this like historic morbid curiosity for these presidents who either died in office or who were assassinated. But it's an amazing story of our history, because of the 8 vice presidents who accidentally became president upon the death of their predecessor, really all but one of them had completely different views than their predecessor. None of them were integrated into the administration, and just about every single one of them either started a war, ended a war, or either accelerated racial progress or significantly slowed it down. But these were at major moments in American history, right? So after America wins the war against Mexico, in the 1840s, they're left sort of with, what do they do with all of this territory that had been ceded to America, and potentially upsetting the slave balance? A president died amidst that moment. The Civil War was all but won, and Lincoln died without any plan for Reconstruction. If you look at the death of William McKinley, nothing short of a presidential death would have led a man as progressive as Theodore Roosevelt at the time to become president. And it sort of goes on. Truman during World War II, JFK dies in the midst of the march towards Vietnam, and as the civil rights crisis was really reaching a breaking point in this country. So our history is quite fragile, and the framers of the Constitution, they basically winged it when it came to presidential succession. They didn't plan much, and they just kind of hoped it all would work out. And it's remarkable that it took 8 presidents dying in office for a constitutional amendment clarifying what happens when the president dies in office.
Well, you say in your book that the US as a country has a collective focus too much on who the president is and not who the vice president is. And as you say, 8 times in history, the US president had died in office. So history is literally, as you say, changed by the beat of a heart. So these men who were not the voters' choice, who were thrown on the ticket, are an afterthought until the very moment that they take the oath of office. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you 2 examples of where it really matters, right? So let's go to Lincoln, right? So we were supposed to get Abraham Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction, which would have been transformative for the country, and instead the bullet of John Wilkes Booth's single-shot Derringer revolver gave us a Southern slave owner from Tennessee who basically resurrected every old vestige of the South, delegated civil rights to the Southern states. Gave amnesty to every single traitor to the Union, and paved the way for what at the time were known as the Black Codes, which were later formalized as the Jim Crow laws in 1876. Right. So a presidential assassination, literally in that case, handed the country over to a former slave owner, the last president to own slaves, and we paid 100+ year consequence for it. Right. So that's why I say Andrew Johnson was the worst president in history because, whether, regardless of what one thinks of modern presidents, he presided over a set of seminal decisions that to this day we're still paying a price for. Then you look at, FDR's death, and, Harry Truman in his 82 days as vice president had only met FDR twice. He was not briefed on the atomic bomb. He hadn't met a single world leader, hadn't received a single intelligence briefing, didn't receive a readout on the famous meeting in Yalta with Stalin. He was basically a non-entity. And then when FDR dies on April 12th, 1945, the war is at a critical moment. The Battle of Okinawa is raging. It's the fiercest military battle in American history. Stalin was reneging on every single one of his promises from Yalta. Truman had been briefed on the bomb 30 minutes after taking the oath of office. He had to contend with moving potentially 1 million men from the European theater to the Asian Pacific theater, and Hitler was still in a bunker. And yet he spent his first 5 days as president in the famous map room where the war was being planned, literally getting a geography lesson on where these countries were. And so it's this extraordinary thing that everyone knew FDR was going to die. He was a very sick man. And maybe somehow held out hope that he would make it till the end of his administration. Even in that moment, they didn't prepare the vice president for the inevitability that he may become president. Now, that's all been corrected subsequently in modern history, but I don't think we've really learned our lesson in the sense that we still don't, we give the vice president a lot of cosmetic responsibility, but it's often very common too for the president to give the vice president a set of losing issues where basically no matter what you do, some portion of the country is going to be upset with you. And so the vice president really in modern times has become a decoy for issues that are kind of too hot for the president to deal with. And that's a problem because the vice president typically doesn't want them because he or she wants to be president one day. And the president doesn't want them because, they're worried about their numbers and Congress and all these other things.
Well, in this past election, do you think that in this particular instance, having Kamala Harris on the ticket actually helped shape the outcome of the election?
There is no evidence that people if you look all I can do is evaluate it historically, and so this election is one of many data points. There's no evidence that people vote for the vice president; they vote for the president. Where I think a vice presidential choice is helpful is if the presidential candidate is nominated in the context of a fractured party, and I think the Democratic Party right now is a sort of loose, is basically a loose constellation of factions that didn't really agree on anything other than that they didn't like Donald Trump. And in that sense, I do think that Kamala Harris was a smart choice for the moment and helped bring the party a little bit more together. And you could argue that it's hard for a candidate to win without, rallying, the elements of the party, bringing some cohesion to disaffected parts of the party. So in that sense, I think that her selection helped sort of solidify the Democrats behind the Biden-Harris ticket. But I don't think that for the most part, historically, it's been the case that people don't go to the polls and think, oh, who's the vice president? But the caveat to that is there were several things that were unprecedented about this election. So Biden is the oldest president elected in history. I think it would be not a conservative statement, no pun intended, to say that there was a lot of outrage about Donald Trump. It was COVID, and she, is the first. She's not the first woman to be nominated for vice president, but if elected, she would have been the first woman to become vice president, the highest office held by a woman in history, and she was the first nominee of Asian descent. So so for her, for a lot of people in the country, that milestone matters. So I say that people don't go and vote for the vice president, but I also do think people vote for milestones. It's just hard to know how many numbers and so forth. But they won, right? So the ticket clearly worked.
Well, I couldn't help thinking when I was thinking about our talk today, how we do have the oldest president. We do have a woman vice president. 4 years is a very long time. obviously, hopefully everything is smooth and nothing happens, but it's, you know, it's very interesting. It's very interesting where we are at the moment. So with your time in the State Department, you worked with incredibly influential women, and it is fairly unusual to remain on during a transition. And of course, last week we saw history being made in both the Madam Speaker and Madam Vice President flanking President Biden in his first 100 days address. Do you think that this will translate into the American people voting in future presidents that are representative of diversity of the population?
Yeah, there's no doubt that we're moving rapidly in this direction. And it's close to linear. It'll be a little volatile along the way in the sense that we'll take some steps forward on social progress. We'll take some steps backwards, but there's no doubt that the net momentum is moving forward. I mean, I think that even especially among young voters, it's a different country. And if you look at the history of this country, even in moments where things have seemed frustrated, ultimately kind of social justice progresses over time. Again, there's slide backs, and we've certainly seen a lot of those slide backs lately, but there's also heightened awareness, more voices, if you just look at the sort of discourse in this country, when you sort of sift through all the disinformation and so forth, what you see is a country demanding not just greater equality and greater inclusion, but greater representation. And people vote, people sort of speak with their votes. And look at, you mentioned, Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President. We had a woman as a presidential nominee. I mean, for a long time, it was just Geraldine Ferraro in the 70s as the vice presidential nominee. So the trends are all positive. And the other thing, look, for all the talk about the march of authoritarianism around the world and a democratic recession around the world and a rise of populism around the world, you have a prime minister in Serbia who's not just a woman, but the first gay head of government in Serbia, in a country with a very high percentage of the population that is polled as anti-gay. You have arguably the most powerful leader in Europe for the past several decades is a woman in Chancellor Merkel. You have women in leadership positions in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and so all of this reinforces each other. And so I think that the trends are all really positive. I think the key is you can't get complacent, right? I think that we're seeing a big push now, to have greater representation and inclusion, not just at the corporate executive level, but in the workforce, and not just in the workforce, but in tech, where I am, making sure it's not just non-technical roles, but in sort of critical engineering and product roles. So the progress is happening, not everywhere at the same pace, and we should never be satisfied with it. There's a lot of work to do, but I think that the trends are moving in the right direction.
You often say that in challenging environments, necessity drives innovation. So you speak of a profound time in your life in 2004 when you were in an Iranian bazaar, and you describe the moment that had great impact on how you see the world today. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, of course. So I was a graduate student at Oxford at the time, and I had convinced the Iranian embassy to give me a visa by telling them that I was an archaeology student and I wanted to study the glory of Persepolis. So much to their chagrin, they gave me a visa, and I went to Iran. I had no interest in technology back in 2004. Literally, it wasn't my interest. I went there to interview opposition leaders and reformers, and I got in trouble pretty early in my trip. And they told me to keep a low profile if I wanted to stay in the country. So I started wandering around Iran looking for friends to hang out with and talk to. And I had this moment in Iran that really changed my entire professional life, which is I was in this busy intersection in a marketplace in the southern city of Shiraz. And there was a group of young people kind of crowded around, and they were all on their phones. And I asked one of them what they were doing. And basically what I learned is they were using Bluetooth technology to call and text complete strangers. To invite them to underground parties, and as an American, you're as somebody who grows up in a free and open society, that seems like a very strange use case that sort of defies all logic of social norms and what you would use Bluetooth for. But it dawned on me at that moment that what I was actually seeing play out in the street of Iran was, a tale of two innovation stories. The first innovation story is the people who build the technology largely in the developed world to solve one set of problems. And then the second story of innovation is the rest of the world with a totally different set of needs, finding innovative use cases for that technology to solve an entirely different set of problems. And it's that latter case that ends up answering the question, why does any of this technology matter? So let's take a sort of current example, which is everybody's obsessed with cryptocurrency and digital assets and stored value. I think we're in the most nascent stage of that first innovation story, and it's only when we fundamentally change the way that value moves around the world that all of these people in developing economies will tell us why any of this matters. And I think that we're gonna see something really transformative when that happens. They're gonna end up teaching all of the smart engineers and talented people, here in the U.S. and Europe why their technology matters, and it'll be a mixed story, right? I saw this with the internet, right? Which is, when I first started working at Google, there wasn't a huge, developing world story of technology, and that story has been very volatile. It's been mixed. There's been great opportunity that's come from it. There's been great hardship that's come with it. And basically what happened was the sort of, the information environment or the access revolution ultimately connected to the geopolitical system, and the internet, surprise, surprise, reflected all of the complexities of the physical world. And it's the same thing in the sort of crypto economy. Eventually, the crypto economy will connect to the global economy, and then eventually the crypto economy will connect with the geopolitical system. And again, that will come with all of the baggage and complexity of the geopolitical system.
Jared, who is the most accidental of the accidental presidents that you describe in the book? You did an incredible and heroic job of the research. Who do you look at and say that was a true accident?
I mean, it's hard to argue with the first one, right? Because William Henry Harrison gets elected in 1840 and then dies 30 days later. There's no precedent for this happening in history. And the vice president, who was only thrown on the ticket to win Virginia, which they ultimately lost, scrambles back to Washington and is the only one that thinks he's the president. So he ends up sort of having that fight with Congress and having that fight with the cabinet, and he sets a precedent that the vice president becomes president that as recently as November 22nd, 1963 was responsible for, being interpreted as Lyndon Johnson isn't just acting as president, but becomes president. So I don't think anyone expected the president to die, let alone die after 30 days.
Well, the other thing that I found so fascinating in the book is just how nowadays we all live with all the media and the fake news and the anger and polarization on both sides. And it feels like this is the worst that it's ever been. But as I read through the book, you realize it was so much more worse back then. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I always say that we have problems today adjusted for political inflation. But yes, it's true. I mean, it's what was fascinating about writing this book is it was a little dose of political sobriety, in the sense that I started writing this book before anybody was thinking about Donald Trump, and then the whole Trump era happened, and people were sort of hysterical for 4 years, and they're still hysterical to some degree. And I'm reading about brawls in Congress. I'm reading about a senator pulling a gun on another senator and trying to shoot him right there on the Senate floor, and then an hour-long brawl ensuing, after which everybody's clothes were ripped and everyone calmed down and just apologized and got back to work. And by the way, my favorite part about that story is the insults were so much more eloquent back then. So a senator from the senator who pulled the gun on his colleague in 1850 did so because his colleague charged him with inconsistency. So that's what the threshold was. That's what the threshold was back then. But I mean, you had, in one instance, you had, a member of Congress going into the Senate chamber, nearly beating a senator to death with his cane. I mean, really, dueling was a common thing. And while history gives us a useful frame of reference, it doesn't absolve us of responsibility to deal with our demons today. And so I don't sort of share examples of what the past was like as a way to get us off the hook. But I think that it's helpful to have the history to guide us. And I think that change ultimately happens when somebody in a leadership position who looks the part of a particularly stubborn political faction ends up having the courage to make meaningful change, right? And so in the case of Lyndon Johnson, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would not have been possible had somebody from Texas with a real Southern drawl, who is known as a segregationist, had sort of mastery of this. It took somebody like that breaking rank with the norms of that particularly Southern segregationist faction to shepherd civil rights legislation through in 1964. And what's interesting about that particular moment, two things happened. One, only someone like that could bring the Southern segregationists along. Two, the civil rights activists and the civil rights movement gave him the space to do that without sort of forcing him to reconcile past actions and without forcing him to sort of atone for past actions. And I'm not saying that was right or wrong. I'm just making an observation, and that probably wouldn't work today. But had Johnson not been given the space by civil rights leaders to do this in the way that he knew he could do it, you would not have had civil rights legislation in 1964. If you didn't have civil rights legislation in 64, I'm not sure you would have had it in 67, and I'm not sure you would have had it in 68.
Right, and those were the consequential outcomes.
65 and 68, yeah.
You speak of multiple identities that we as people have with all of our multiple online profiles and social media present. Can you talk about the importance of digital health as we go forward?
Yeah, so I think about digital health in a couple different ways. So on the multiple personalities part, the average person today has, not the average person, but a hyper-connected person has a WhatsApp, account, a Signal account, a Telegram account, a Facebook profile. Maybe they're on TikTok, Snapchat. You have your work email, your personal email. You text certain people, and you use each of those things for different purposes. And there's nuanced differences in your behavior as you operate a multi-platform life. And more people each day interact with you on one of those platforms than will interact with you physically. That's certainly the case during COVID, but even absent COVID, that's the case. So we're all kind of walking around with this virtual entourage of ourselves. And it's a virtual entourage because each manifestation of ourselves is different on each of those platforms. Otherwise, you wouldn't need a separate email for work and a separate email for personal, or you wouldn't use Signal instead of WhatsApp. So I figure I have 10 different versions of Jared that in aggregate forms the digital version of Jared. And then I'm still a physical human being that interacts with people. And it's a different way to think about ourselves, right? Because, I look at that and I don't think I'm not being fake with my personality. I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. People certainly do that. But what I've learned about myself in that process is there's nuanced differences in my personality in different contexts, and depending on who I talk to. And I have certain sensitivities in one context versus another. I may be funnier in another context than another one. So it's the very act of being a digital person who splits your time between physical and digital worlds is actually a soul-searching experience, in the sense that you learn a lot about the different parts of your personality. They're just sort of diffused throughout all these different platforms, as opposed to just stuck in your brain. The other thing that I think is interesting is kids are just coming online younger and faster than any other time in history, and so the maturation process happens faster online than the physical realities. And this adds a lot of complexity because we don't have a lot of history dealing with that in schools, in households, and then the people in schools and households grew up under a very different process than we did, so they're not familiar with it. So that's what I mean when I talk about digital health. I think it's still very much to be determined, how all of this nets out for a young generation, and then add COVID to it, and all these kids who are at home, who were supposed to have no screen time until they're 3 or 5 or whatever it is, have all of a sudden, had their technology experience accelerated. And so that's a whole other dimension to this.
Your second daughter, Annabelle's second name is Garfield. How did that come about?
So I got stuck on the Garfield to Arthur chapter when my wife was pregnant with our second daughter, and I was sitting at the dining room table, and we were trying to sort of figure out middle names, and I looked at this like big out of print book from the 1880s about James Garfield, and I said, why don't we just call her Garfield? And then there was a debate about the implications of a middle name of a president who was assassinated after 4 months. We sort of joked that we could always backpedal and say it's after the cartoon character. But part of the reason we did it as well is I think James Garfield was the most remarkable man ever to rise to the presidency. He was the last president born in a log cabin, absolutely brilliant, incredibly cerebral, a real moralist, literally came from nothing, probably the most impoverished man ever to rise to the presidency. And he used to hide runaway slaves, as part of the Underground Railroad when he was a kid. And the tragedy of the accidental president story, I told you the story of the impact that Lincoln's assassination had on civil rights in this country. What's interesting about James Garfield is he's the only man ever to be elected president who wasn't running for his party's nomination. He entered the 1880 Republican convention as the campaign manager for the guy who was running third, the governor of Ohio. And on the 35th ballot, somebody shouted his name, and against his own protest, he got the nomination and eventually won the presidency. So he was unattached to partisan politics, unattached to machine politics, and his inaugural address was all about universal education, racial equity, universal suffrage. And because he didn't owe anything to anybody, I always say that the story of civil rights in post-Civil War America, it's a tale of two presidential assassinations. Lincoln's assassination, which set things in motion towards Jim Crow, and Garfield's assassination, which removed the one chance we had to stem the tide of Jim Crow.
A couple of rapid fire questions before we wrap up our portion. Who was the most remarkable president?
So my favorite president is Theodore Roosevelt. He, by the way, nobody would have liked him in modern times. He was the opposite of the person you would want to be in a classroom with. He was obnoxious. He was verbose, never shut up. But he was probably the biggest Renaissance man ever to rise to the presidency, and he changed the social fabric of this society, from anti-corruption to bringing awareness to what was happening to newly arrived immigrants, to early trust busting. I mean, he was just a remarkable figure. Honestly, dropped into the early 1900s from like a totally different chapter of history. I mean, just a constant fish out of water. But what I've always appreciated about Theodore Roosevelt is he was like the ultimate curiosity chaser. And what was interesting is he was actually a very depressive person. He suffered from severe mental depression, and he was hyperactively curious as a way to outpace his depression. His story is a reminder that there's many things that make us curious. But I think that curiosity meant that he was always fulfilled and unfulfilled at the same time.
Your personal favorite? Yes.
I mean, it's also my personal favorite. So
So the most scandalous?
The most scandalous was Warren Harding. He was the first president to have multiple cabinet members go to prison. He fathered an illegitimate child in a 5x5 hat closet of the Oval Office, which is one of his many affairs. He had an affair with a German World War I spy when he was in the Senate, and had actually been tailed by the FBI. He had a secret house with an underground tunnel to it near the White House on H Street, where they had call girls, bootlegging, fight fixing. His attorney general had his own stock ticker in his office, and right before he would do things, he would buy and trade stocks. So my favorite quote to sum up Warren Harding comes from actually Theodore Roosevelt's first daughter, who said, Warren Harding's not a bad man, he's just a slob.
Well, you obviously had a lot of fun writing that chapter. It must have been very entertaining.
It was a scandal-ridden. As my mother said, she said, I didn't follow most of your book or read all of it, but I really liked the Harding chapter because it was really smutty.
And so the worst president of the 8?
And so Andrew Johnson, for the reasons that I mentioned before, just because we paid a price for what he did in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Absolutely. Jared, thank you very, very much. We will move on to the Q&A with Alice. Alice Handy is doing her PhD in engineering and is a member of the MCR Angevin Talks Committee. And I encourage everyone to read The Accidental Presidents. It's a fascinating book and certainly gave me a different color on American history and where we are today and how we could go forward. I will see you after the Q&A. Thank you very much. Alice, over to you.
Thank you both for what was a really interesting discussion. We now invite questions from the audience, both on Zoom and on YouTube. And if I may take my chance to ask a question. So in the US, as well as here in the UK, there's been lengthy discussions about the installation of 5G networks from the Chinese Huawei. We now see under President Biden that we're already forging a fight for 6G. And there are also challenges to the coalition that has governed the internet from both China and Russia. How do you see the future of the internet and 6G playing out, and particularly this Chinese involvement?
Yeah, no, I think that's the seminal question that's going to dominate the next decade plus. If you believe the biggest challenge that's going to define the international system is great power competition between the U.S. and China. And so let me answer this at a high level by saying I think that we have an ad hoc approach right now. And that ad hoc approach doesn't work. And the approach before didn't work, which was that we should bring China into the liberal international order and they'll become just like us and conform. That did not prove to be the case. China wants to rewrite the international order. And as it pertains to technology, where the international order hasn't been written, they want to write it. And they have a strategy of be bigger, better, faster. And they, if you look just objectively at the trends right now, they are producing 5 times the number of software engineers at the same speed. They're beating us in facial recognition, voice recognition, quantum communications. We're about even in venture investment, about even in phone manufacturing. They're beating us in e-commerce. They have 80% of the commercial drone market. And they not only have a first mover advantage in 5G, they basically have the only viable 5G option that is being offered in the developing world, besides Finland and some smaller players, that is more than something that works in a football stadium. And so, what do I think is actually going on here? Why great power competition is not a new concept. So why is everybody talking about technology now? I think that COVID illuminates why we're talking about technology right now, which is we are in a competition with China, and they believe they have a model of efficiency that's better, and we believe we have a model of efficiency that's better. Our model of efficiency is a values-based techno-democratic model. Their model is a sort of top-down authoritarian techno-autocratic model. They call it techno-nationalist. They can do techno-nationalism or techno-authoritarianism on their own. They're big enough to do that. We can't do techno-democracy unilaterally. We need a multilateral coalition to be big enough to be competitive, since so many of the asymmetries benefit them. No separation of public and private sector, size of population, amount of money, ability to skirt the rules, intellectual property theft, you name it. Looser, norms around surveillance and what they're willing to collect from their population, et cetera. All that is very obvious to this group. And so, it's not good enough to pound our chest and say American exceptionalism, we'll win this competition because, we've always ended up on top. The facts tell us that this is an asymmetric competition that the Chinese are winning. And it doesn't matter that we had the first mover advantage. They had the first mover advantage on strategy, and it's allowed them to eclipse our first mover advantage in technology. So my proposal for this is we need to first get our democratic house in order, because we can't do this, this fight one-to-one. So I've proposed creating a new multilateral architecture of advanced democracies that also have a significant amount of the democratic world's technological capacity outside of government. And you build a new, it can be formal or informal, but you build a new architecture called a sort of a T12, a technology 12 of these countries. And you set an agenda not to tackle everything technology, but you pick the things that actually, where the governance model matters, and where it's high stakes and highly competitive. So what are those things? Semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, central bank-backed digital currencies and electronic payments, supply chains. The list kind of goes. 5G, 6G. The list kind of goes on. And those countries, you can sort of debate what the countries would be, but the U.S., Canada, France, Germany, UK, Netherlands because of semiconductors, South Korea, Japan, Israel, Australia. You could throw in Taiwan as an observer if you want. India is a little questionable these days, but probably India. So this has been my proposal. I've written about this, and I've been kind of evangelizing this. I think if you can't get your democratic house in order, there's no competition. We're not even on the field. And I believe in a sort of narrowly focused agenda, again, highly competitive technology where the stakes are very high. As it pertains to decoupling, it may be necessary to do selective decoupling. I don't believe that we should march towards like a total bifurcation of the internet. That's not in anybody's interest. And by the way, I don't think the Chinese want that either. And this isn't the Cold War. One side's not going to defeat the other. We're going to have to sort of imagine a world of competitive coexistence as it pertains to technology. But like any competition, you want to have the upper hand and be the dominant player. So we have to also imagine what the desired end state is here.
Thank you for what was a very comprehensive answer to that question. Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Mohammed, and they ask, you and your colleagues at Jigsaw are highly respected for their ability to look around corners really well, especially when it comes to the interaction of geopolitics and tech. Is there something special about how you structure Jigsaw and how all hires and organize people?
Yeah, it's a great question, and as much as I'd love to say we're psychic, we're not. So the question is, how do you create a manufactured crystal ball? And the way you create a manufactured crystal ball is so Jigsaw is in the business of looking at the problems that are destabilizing the internet. So disinformation, spread of extremism, organized harassment, toxicity in conversation, nefarious cyber attacks, censorship, all the things that you can imagine. And so there's a set of state and non-state actors in the world who are largely responsible for all of that mischief at scale. And every single one of those state and non-state actors has some demographic or geography that they target first and worst and use as hubs of innovation for nefarious cyber activity. So if you want a crystal ball, so let's take disinformation as an example. If you're worried about Russian disinformation 2 years from now, right? So Jigsaw looks at like a 2-year time horizon. So if you're worried about these problems that are now not niche problems anymore, they're problems that everybody accepts, the Jigsaw approach is how will it manifest 2 years into the future? So the way to understand that in the context of Russia or China is you spend a lot of time looking at, what they're doing in Ukraine, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, which they're basically using as target practice. So we have a very simple, formula of, forward deploying engineers to those places, engaging with civil society, developer communities in those places to see what the anomalies are. Basically, what are the tactics that we've never seen before? So I'll give you a great example of this, which is, we first learned about what became known as deepfakes in very late 2016 after the election. And we learned about it because we had been doing some research on the deep and dark web, the part of the web that's not indexed and requires special software to access. And I had a Ukrainian engineer on my team who was, talking to some of the sort of digital arms merchants. and said, these guys are saying they're in Russia, but I know their accents, and I've asked them enough questions. They're in Ukraine, and I think they're in like near the Donbass, in the east. And so we finally arranged for them to meet with us. So I actually personally flew to Ukraine, and met with these. I had like the equivalent of an internet date with like digital arms merchants from the deep and dark web. And after we sort of built their trust, and dangled the prospect of like maybe exploring something with them for research purposes, we asked them to tell us like, what are some things you're experimenting with? And they showed us how they were starting to distort videos. So that was interesting to us, because the ability to distort in motion, not just imagery and words, was something that, one, we felt politicians would have an easy time understanding and likely become hysterical about. Two, it was sufficiently scary to us, so therefore it would be scary to other people who maybe knew less. And three, we had a few theories of change about how we could get at this. So we went back and we built the world's largest training data set of deepfakes in the entire world, all synthetically created. And we asked two questions. Can you detect falsity in motion? From a technical perspective, and then two, if you can detect it, how do you convey that information to people in ways that change their behavior? It turns out you can't do either. We could detect a deepfake with a 90+% accuracy if we knew the technique that was used to generate the deepfake, which is basically never. And then it dropped to like 40% efficacy if you didn't know the technique, with tons of false positives. Then we did all these UX, user experience studies, to figure out like how can you sort of convey falsity. So we took Richard Nixon in motion with his audio, and we put famous actors' faces on Nixon, which famous actors who people would know. And we did these focus groups, and to us it was very obvious that like Walter Matthau is not resigning the presidency effective at noon tomorrow, or like Brad Pitt's not resigning the presidency, but we would sort of convey this falsity to users, and no matter how we conveyed it in these focus groups, all it did seem to do was encourage people to want to share it more. So we realized there was both a technical problem and a sociological problem. So all of this is happening like multiple years before anybody is saying the word deepfake, thinking about deepfake, all because there's some experimentation happening in Ukraine. But it makes a lot of sense, right? Which is the latest and greatest techniques. There's nothing that a country like Russia will do to the US in the future that they won't do to Ukraine first and worse. Same thing with China and Taiwan and Hong Kong, and you can think of lots of other examples. So that's how we look around the corner, and we do that in every single context, with all the different problems that we work on.
Thank you. I'll keep these thick and fast. So our next question is from Emily. They ask, it has been said that the only countries standing up to big tech, such as Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, are those in the EU. What is your view on this? What do you see as the future of the power of these select number of unelected individuals in these big companies? And how far can they stretch their social license to operate? For example, is handing over our data, personal data, a price that we're always going to be willing to pay for functionality?
So I guess I don't view it in such a binary way, right? And I guess I view everything through the lens of great power competition. And I think one of the challenges we have is the tech sector is not monolithic. 2, countries are not monolithic. 3, the EU is not monolithic, even though it has a political union on top of the economic union. You're all in Europe right now. You know very well that each of these countries has its own mind, and I think COVID has shown that. So I think what I'm advocating is 2 conversations. I want to siphon off the conversations about the critical tech, where the democratic world cannot afford to cede a competitive advantage to China. And I want to build a multilateral architecture around that, for the democratic world to put aside its differences around privacy and all these other issues that I know are very important, to make sure that they don't get conflated with these critical issues where we all need to work together. I think that will make it easier to work through some of these issues that are dominating a lot of the regulatory discourse. Because these are really important issues. I don't deny that at all. But it seems challenging to have the same conversation be about nuanced differences around what should or shouldn't be regulated or legislated, and conversations about how we compete with China. So I guess what I'm arguing is we can do both, but we don't have great multilateral mechanisms for doing this, because we're still operating on a set of multilateral mechanisms that predate ubiquity of the internet, right? I mean, it was fascinating about our sort of multilateral democratic order is it's largely built around geography, not around issue, not around capacity and capability. And so that's I don't mean that as a cop out. I just think there's two separate conversations. Like, I want to be able to talk to governments about how we make sure the successor to ISIS doesn't exploit the internet, without that being the same conversation as a set of things that we're talking about around a lot of these sort of nuanced and important discussions that are sort of, defining the regulatory space. Like, they're just two very different contexts.
Thank you. Our next question is from Andrea, who says, many view lawmakers and those in office to be consistently playing catch up when it comes to safeguarding and protecting citizens online. Is this true? To what extent does this work have to be reactive?
So I think we have a fundamental problem, which is that the vast majority of the technical expertise exists outside of government. It's not to say there's not expertise in government. Like, I actually think, you're all in the UK. GCHQ is a phenomenally talented, technical organization. So I'm not one of these people who says the government are Luddites, but at all. But it's often the case that the pace of innovation is happening faster outside of government than government can catch up with. And again, I come back to, I don't mean this as a bureaucratic answer, but like, what are the mechanisms to resolve that, right? So this is, I think, what I said before COVID was, it seems like authoritarian systems are having an easier time dealing with the problems of being closed than open societies are dealing with the complexity of being open. And your question is kind of, evidence of that, which is, we didn't anticipate that, by being open, we would have a hard time, keeping a pace with all of the sort of nefarious activity associated with exploiting openness, right? So, but I don't think it's doomsday. I just think we're in a turbulent period right now where we're still figuring this out. I do think some of this gets generationally corrected as generations of digital natives take more senior positions in government. It's already the case that at least the vocabulary and the foundational understanding of tech is better per capita in parliaments and legislative branches than they were in previous years. So this is a slower trend than we would like. But I also draw your attention to Taiwan, which is interesting. Like the president of Taiwan, is lockstep with the CEO of TSMC, and there's a democratic separation between TSMC and the government. But that technological advantage is so important that the Taiwanese government makes sure that that expertise is always in the room, whether they're talking about maritime security, political security, economic security. And so we do need to figure out a way to get more of that expertise accounted for in the room. I always sort of describe it as a technology interstitial for national security as part of our sort of decision making and thinking.
Thank you. So we're short of time, so we're going to have two final questions. So for this first one, maybe keep the answer brief if possible. So Sebastian asks, in your book, Children of Jihad, you describe the situation in the Middle East around 2005. This region has seen many changes in these 16 years. Unfortunately, also many for the worse. If you were to write a similar book again about the current situation, what would both positive and negative changes be compared to 2005? Whether regarding Hezbollah, Kurdish people, or young students in Iran?
I think that I was more optimistic about technology when I wrote Children of Jihad, and I think that if you look at all the tumultuous activity in the Middle East, I think what we can conclude is what technology did is It allowed large numbers of young people to organize around the lowest common denominator, which is they didn't want a particular leader in power and they wanted to get rid of that leader. And then it didn't answer any of their questions about what they wanted to fill the vacuum. And it didn't produce any new leaders with new last names who had the sort of the political capacity to take the country forward. So my conclusion is that technology accelerated the pace of movement making, but it slowed down leadership development, and it proved that revolutions are easier to start, but they're harder to finish.
Thank you. And so just for me to say thank you so much for a great talk, we'd like to finish with one final question, which is, can leadership be learned or are you born with it?
I think that people can be born with leadership instincts, but leadership is learned experientially, right? So I think that the same way that you can have highly intelligent people that don't have wisdom, I think it's the same thing about leaders. Look, I think about, even in my sort of small, context as a CEO, right? Like I've learned from positive and negative experiences that I've had, not from training manuals or, skills that I have or don't have. It's like, to use an AI analogy, it's like reinforcement learning, right? Like, so you're given the task, be a great leader, and you're not told how to accomplish that. You have a set of experiences, and those experiences, either yield a positive reinforcement or a negative reinforcement, and over time you sort of learn how to play the game of leadership, and you get better, and the positive reinforcements overshadow the negative reinforcement. So I think experiential learning is critical.
Thank you so much. I'll hand over to Anna.
Alice, thank you so much. Jared, thank you for a fascinating discussion. We can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with us today, and we look forward to welcoming you to Queen's in person in the very near future. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to all. Thank you. And thank you to all for attending. This was, as Alice said, our fifth and last Angevin talk in the series, and we are looking forward to picking it up, hopefully in person, again in the Michaelmas term later this year. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening. And thanks again, Jared.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.